released in 2008 exclusively for the PlayStation 3, and developed by Kojima Productions and published by Konami. It's Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots. The game was once again directed by Hideo Kojima, as well as written by him and Shuyo Murata. Acting as a direct sequel to Metal Gear Solid 2, once again you play as Solid Snake, or well, as the game now refers to him at times, as Old Snake. Set in 2014, 9 years after the events of Shadow Moses in Metal Gear Solid 1, and 5 years after the events of the Big Shell incident in Metal Gear Solid 2, and 50 years after the events of Operation Snake Eater in Metal Gear Solid 3, in an alternate future run by the war economy, global PMCs now being larger than the normal militaries of the world, all being controlled of course by a system run by nanomachines in their bodies. War has truly changed, and Snake has seen better days. Due to him being a clone, his body was designed with accelerated aging in mind to prevent him from being used by the enemy, or from him going renegade, so he quite literally can't outlive his usefulness to the Patriots, who now run the governments of the world from the shadows with nobody keeping them in check. Given only a year to live, when his former commanding officer Roy Campbell approaches him with one final mission to stop Liquid, Snake accepts this task in a last-ditch attempt at stopping Liquid and truly solving this mystery of the Patriots and putting an end to their control. And of course, to keep things spoiler-free, sure enough, things don't go quite as planned, and Liquid begins his plot to take control of the system himself.
The system is mine! Your guns and your weapons are no longer your own. Behold! Guns of the Patriots.
So it's up to Solid Snake one last time to put an end to it all. But isn't it any good? Starting things off first with the good.
Otacon, is this your idea of a compliment?
Yes! You're the toughest, craziest, most hardcore badass on the planet. You're the shit.
The story in Metal Gear Solid 4 is the key element of the game, as this basically is the final chapter in Solid Snake's story and overall the end chapter of the series itself, acting as a direct sequel to Metal Gear Solid 2 as I said earlier, and in some aspects even a sequel to Metal Gear Solid 3 outside of the obvious number progression. And thankfully, Metal Gear Solid 4 achieves an amazing send-off to Solid Snake, an end chapter for the series itself, and without spoiling anything, for Snake's final mission, it's not one you want to miss. Bringing back plenty of previous characters from Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2, and even a few other surprises, the story attempts in many ways to conclude every possible loose end, and for the most part, it does a decent job of it.
Brother! It's been too long.
For the most part, but we'll get into that later. On the gameplay side of things, Metal Gear Solid 4 doesn't stray very far from the standard Metal Gear formula at this point in the series. It more or less polishes things from previous games, but that's not to say there isn't anything new. Metal Gear Solid 4 introduces the Octo Camo system, which is more or less an automated variation of changing camouflage like in Metal Gear Solid 3. This time around, Snake can place himself against a wall or an object or lay flat on the floor, and his camouflage will change automatically depending on the environment or objects he's against. This obviously makes his stealth a tad bit easier. And overall, Metal Gear Solid 4's stealth mechanics more or less retain most of the features from the previous games, such as hiding bodies, non-lethal kills, and sneaking, and builds upon them in an overall more polished experience. And now instead of sneaking through a jungle or linear close-quarter environments, Snake's now sneaking through open urban battlefield environments, and it's a nice change of pace and adds a lot more tension as bullets are whizzing by and bombs are dropping everywhere. Metal Gear Solid 4 also polishes and improves upon the controls overall as well. From the control over Snake's movement from running to walking to crouching to going prone, crawling, laying flat and pretending to be dead, it all feels natural and easy to understand and do. The same as well applies to the combat controls. Everything from third-person over-the-shoulder aiming to first-person aiming to throwing grenades and objects. The gunplay overall in Metal Gear Solid 4 is easily the best it's been in the series so far. But most importantly, the CQC combat has been remapped and polished as well. Gone are the days now of pressure-sensitive buttons and accidentally slitting someone's neck by mistake. The CQC controls have been remapped so that when you now grapple an enemy, you can choose between the different actions available by simply pressing the face buttons instead of pressure-sensitive commands. Everything from CQC throwing, to grappling, to choking out and slitting an enemy's throat feels much more refined and easier to do, and even better yet, Metal Gear Solid 4 also introduced a VR training and practice mode, allowing Snake to learn the basics of CQC, and giving you the chance to wrap your head around the controls and practice with different types of weapons. And speaking of weapons, Metal Gear Solid 4 features the most weapons in the series to date. Kojima went absolutely gun crazy for this one. You've got numerous different types of pistols, submachine guns, rifles, grenade types, and tons more to pick and choose from, that can be either found or unlocked for Drebin points, the in-game currency, which you obtain from collecting weapons you already have on the battlefield, and then you use these points to unlock weapons you found or purchase from a huge variety of new ones. And of course, this being a Metal Gear game, it has some incredible boss battles. This time around, Snake is pitted against the Beauty and the Beast unit, as the main bosses in this game. Without spoiling or giving away too much, they're once again the highlight of the game, my personal favorite being the Crying Wolf boss battle, which is more or less a game of cat and mouse, but with sniper rifles. Or in this case, a game of giant mech wolf and old man Snake, but with a sniper rifle and a blizzard on very familiar grounds. As well as a few other boss battles the game may surprise you with. And of course, voice acting is absolutely brilliant once again, with many familiar voices returning to reprise their roles once more, such as Debbie Mae West once again as Meryl.
You're all grown up.
Maybe it's because someone taught me well. A certain legendary hero who suddenly disappeared.
And David Hayter, of course, returning as Solid Snake, and easily my favorite performance in the game, Patrick Zimmerman as Ocelot, or in this case, Liquid Ocelot, who is easily the best Metal Gear villain in the entire franchise.
Nice try. But when it comes to CQC, I've got the upper hand.
But now let's discuss the bad. Now, obviously, one of the complaints people seem to have with Metal Gear Solid 4 is how extremely cutscene heavy it is. And to a degree, I can see why. The introduction to the game is bogged with cutscenes, and the final chapter of the game itself has a cutscene that's well over an hour long. Whether or not this is honestly a bad thing is a matter of opinion. I honestly think the cutscenes are highly stylized and well done, and I'd much rather watch them over two heads and some text on a codec screen for 20 minutes. But I guess that's just me, so I consider this a minor thing more or less. One other minor gripe I do have is you're given an M4 custom rifle that's honestly one of the best rifles in the game, so it gave me very little reason to use any other type of gun.
The M4, the official carbine model used by the U.S. Army, developed from the M16 service rifle. This one's a top-of-the-line model, real popular with the big PMCs. High precision, not like that government-issue shit.
Not to mention the fact I mostly avoided combat in general, and honestly I had very little reason or need to purchase new weapons and rarely ever did. I feel the addition of all these weapons was more or less focused for Metal Gear Online, as opposed to the single-player campaign itself, but this is just a minor nitpick once again. However, personally, my biggest issue with Metal Gear Solid 4 is the story itself, and more importantly, the pacing of it. Metal Gear Solid 4 is, for all intents and purposes, the final game in the series and conclusion to Solid Snake's story. And the story itself attempts to answer everything left in the open from the three previous games before it, and give an answer to almost every question. And in many ways, it tries to answer things that never needed an answer or a conclusion in my opinion to begin with. As for the pacing issues, the first two acts of the game are absolutely brilliant and has some of the best gameplay and overall stealth sections of the game. But by the time Act 3 rolls around, the game's story becomes a grueling explanation fest as the game attempts to do as I said earlier, and attempts to explain everything from the previous games. The game also shifts heavily from a tactical and stealth-focused experience to an all-out action-focused one by the end of the third act. Normally something reserved for the end of a Metal Gear game, and the whole segment just feels horribly clunky despite the polished controls for stealth. The third-person gunplay is nothing spectacular in comparison. And the AI overall is pretty awful at actually shooting you. And do keep in mind this is based off me playing the solid normal setting. And throughout most of the game afterwards, mind you the next half of the game itself, it just feels like the stealth was tossed out the window in favor of a third-person shooter for the most part, but thankfully Act 4 makes up for Act 3 a little bit, with a little more stealth and nostalgia going for it without spoiling anything too much.
Hold it, Snake. Time to change the disc. I know, it's a pain. But you need to swap disc 1 for disc 2. You see the disc labeled 2?
No.
Huh? Oh, wait. We're on PlayStation 3. It's a Blu-ray disc. Dual layered, too. No need to swap.
Damn it, Otacon! Get a grip!
Yeah, what an age we live in, huh, Snake? Wonder what they'll think of next.
But now let's discuss the ugly.
What happened to your face?
Where we discuss the graphics, technical aspects, soundtrack, and general presentation of the game itself. Now, Metal Gear Solid 4 is certainly the opposite of ugly. For a 2008 release, Metal Gear Solid 4 looked absolutely fantastic and was cutting edge for the hardware it was on at the time. From the attention to detail on the character models, which still look impressive even for today's standards, to the war-torn environments, to the incredible but lengthy cutscenes that also featured seamless transition to gameplay with no loading in between after each scene. Metal Gear Solid 4 was easily one of the best-looking games of 2008 on consoles. Aside from a few low framerate dips and long install times, the game also ran perfectly fine, bug, glitch, and crash-free during my 12 or so hours I spent with it. And of course, Metal Gear Solid 4 keeps up the tradition of having an incredible soundtrack like the previous games in the series. Snake now has access to his iPod, which allows him to listen to previous Metal Gear Solid soundtracks, and other soundtracks from previous Konami games, and a few other things. I also appreciate how in the year 2014, Snake is still rocking a first-generation iPod. Metal Gear Solid 4 overall is a great send-off to Solid Snake and conclusion to his story. I thought some of the pacing in the story was a little bit all over the place, and the game felt like it was trying far too hard to answer everything. But overall, it did manage it in the end. I also feel on the gameplay side of things, this is easily the most polished game to date in the franchise, and improved upon a lot of the overall controls from previous games, which is always nice. And obviously, this isn't a game for everyone. If you haven't played a Metal Gear Solid game prior to this, I highly recommend you do, as the game almost requires it with the amount of narrative and backstory it expects you to already know. But if you're a fan like myself, I thought the conclusion was well done in the end. But now, it's time for the rating.
Go near the lake. Keep your eyes wide open and look for Sneaky Snake. Now maybe you won't see him, maybe you won't hear, but he will sneak up behind you and drink all of your root beer, and then Sneaky Snake goes dancing.
Find what you're looking for?
Something happened to me last Thursday when I was driving home. I had a couple of miles to go. I looked up and saw a glowing orange object in the sky to the east. It was moving very irregularly. Suddenly, there was intense light all around me. When I came to, I was home.